Thank you all for being here this evening. It's a wonderful thing to be back in San Sebastian. 3 years ago, I was here for the first time, and I found this to be one of the warmest, most beautiful places on the planet Earth. So I'm very happy to be back again. Now, I'm an evolutionary biologist, and so my real work is about things that happened 100 million years ago, 200 million years ago, and 300 million years ago. But I'm also interested in the history of my discipline. And this is really a sideline. This is something I do for fun. But what I hope to show you this evening is that it's a really important thing to ask about the nature of scientific discovery. And what I'll try to do here is ask a very simple question, which is, first, what is evolution? And I'm going to give you a very simple answer. It is descent with modification over time. In terms of life. Very simple. That's what evolution is. So let me give you a personal example of evolution in my own life. 90 years ago, my ancestors, my mother, the little girl at the top of the stairs, and my grandfather, they look a lot like me. They're humans. There's even some family resemblance. So not much evolution has happened in the last 90 years. That's not to say none, but very little. But now let me tell you about my ancestors 400 million years ago. This is what my great, 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 etc. infinity parents looked like. This is a fish essentially crawling out of water to begin a lineage of animals that will be on Earth and out of water. It's essentially a fish out of water. But that's what my ancestors, also your ancestors, looked like 400 million years ago. Now let's go back a little bit further. 650 million years ago, all of us had an ancestor that was just a single cell. No legs, no head, nothing that we would resemble. It looks a lot like this organism here. It's called a choanoflagellate. It has a little tail that comes up. But that's what our ancestors all looked like. Now that is descent with modification. If I can imagine that that organism, 650 million years ago, gave rise ultimately through its descendants to everyone here in this wonderful auditorium. Now, who discovered evolution? This is also a fairly straightforward question, and to ask this question, we need to go back to this little boy at the age of 7. This little boy at the age of 7, this is a portrait that was painted in 1816, would go on, he loved natural history, but his father was a medical doctor, and his grandfather was a medical doctor. And so there was a lot of family pressure for this little boy to become a medical doctor. And in fact, this little boy, when he turned 16, was sent to the University of Edinburgh to medical school to become a doctor. The person I'm talking about is Charles Darwin. And Charles Darwin, it turns out, in Edinburgh, found out that he did not like the sight of blood. He was sickened. This is before anesthetics. So you can imagine what it would like to actually watch an operation. So Charles Darwin is actually a college dropout. He dropped out of the University of Edinburgh and went back to his family home. And his father, a little bit frustrated that he wasn't going to have a son go on to be a doctor, decided that he would send his son to the University of Cambridge in Cambridge, England. Now, was Charles Darwin the top student in the University of Cambridge? The answer is absolutely not. As he himself wrote, during the 3 years which I spent at Cambridge, my time was wasted, as far as the academical studies were concerned, as completely as at Edinburgh and at school before that. In fact, Darwin had a lot of fun. He had good friends. He loved collecting insects, bugs. Here is a cartoon one of his friends made. That's Charles Darwin with a net riding a beetle to collect other beetles. So, he was not a great student. He wasn't a terrible student. He loved natural history. Now, he finishes college at the University of Cambridge, and you would think that now he should go and get a job. But like many young people who have to have a conversation with their parents about what happens after they have a degree, Charles Darwin had other ideas. He was offered an opportunity through one of his professors to get on a boat and journey around the world. This does not sound like a job that pays. But his father relented, And instead of making sure that Charles Darwin went off to get a job, he let Charles Darwin go on the voyage of the Beagle, which would be a 5-year trip around the world. This was a ship that was surveying ports for the British Navy, and he was there essentially to keep the captain company and also to do natural history. And he saw amazing things over the 5 years. He saw insects all over the world. He saw fossils all over the world. He saw nature and biodiversity at a level that one could never imagine if you never left this little island of England and Wales. This was the world of nature. And when he came back, he was a changed person. He moves to London to begin to work on all of his natural history collections. And he begins to open up a notebook where he writes his reflections. And here is a page from this notebook. I think at the top. And you see a branching sort of set of sticks. Think of a family tree of your own. There would be the ancestors at the bottom of their family tree, and the descendants would be the branches of that family tree. This is a family tree for life. Darwin has had the insight that all of the diversity of plants and of animals and of fungi is here because it evolved, because it went from an ancestor through generations, and through those generations it went through time. And to put a little bit of something he didn't have on his pictures, there's that common ancestor for us, a single-celled organism. There is our ancestor moving on to land. There is my mother. And there are some of our cousins in the evolutionary sense hanging out of trees, other primates. So now we have this young man who knows that the world has evolved, that life comes from a single source. But he doesn't know how it has evolved, and that takes another year. And we know in his own words what happened. In 1838, he said he began to appreciate how much there was a struggle for existence, how much organisms competed for their life, and that there was lots that was left behind that didn't survive or reproduce. And he said, it once struck me that favorable variations would tend to be preserved and unfavorable ones to be destroyed. The results would be the formation of a new species. If you had new modifications, mutations, that gave you some advantage, you would reproduce more than those organisms that didn't. And this is the process of natural selection. An extraordinary insight, not into the fact of evolution, but the process of evolution. It is what we now refer to as survival of the fittest. So this is 1838. What does Darwin do? He continues to study. He thinks, he studies, he reads everything possible. He also gets married. He moves to the country. He begins a family. He's a wonderful father, a devoted husband. And finally, in 1842, he decides he's ready to write a short essay about how evolution works. This is a manuscript page from this essay. It was never published during his lifetime. He said, I'll just write my ideas out and leave it in a drawer and think about it some more. And he rewrites this essay in 1844, and he again puts it in a drawer. He doesn't show it to anyone except his wife, Emma. And then something very interesting happens. He goes into a new phase, a diversion, perhaps you might think. He becomes in love with barnacles. Perfect for this place because barnacles are familiar to anyone who lives by the seashore. For 8 years, from 1846 to 1854, Charles Darwin obsessed about, studied, and then published 4 volumes on barnacles. So you might think he's kind of abandoned his evolutionary ideas. This is not true. He still has them. He's still building up his knowledge. He's still reading. And finally, in 1856, a few of his friends persuade him that he needs to write this out in a book. So he begins, and here is a manuscript page, beginning in 1856, Darwin writes this book. And it is very, very, very long. And it is very, very, very technical. And it is, I can tell you, very, very hard to read. It has 1,000 citations of the scientific literature. And you'll notice I say it ended in 1858. It, again, was not published during his lifetime. And here's an amazing thing that happened, and this is true. Halfway around the world in Malaysia, in the Malay archipelago, there was another person from England, a younger person than Darwin by about 9 or 10 years, and his name was Alfred Russel Wallace. And he spent 8 years studying the biodiversity of the Malay archipelago. At great risk, great danger, he went to all of these different islands. He looked at the birds, the insects, the plants. And then in 1858, the year that Darwin stopped writing his book, he has in Malaysia this wonderful insight. Alfred Russel Wallace thinks, why do some die and some live? And the answer clearly that on the whole, the best fitted live. From the effects of disease, the most healthy escaped. From enemies, the strongest. Then it suddenly flashed upon me that this self-acting process would necessarily improve the race, because in every generation, the inferior would inevitably be killed off, and the superior would remain. That is, the fittest would survive. This, in fact, is natural selection. Now, did Wallace know that Darwin had thought of natural selection in 1838? No. Did Darwin know that Wallace had just thought of natural selection in 1858? No. So what does Wallace do? This is an amazing question. He thinks, I have a great idea, I will write a manuscript, and I will publish it. So he writes his ideas down in a nice short manuscript all about natural selection. And he decides he needs to send it, and it will take months to go on ships, eventually to Paris, to the railroad, cross the channel, and eventually make its way to England, where he hopes someone will help him take this manuscript and put it in a publication. Who did he write? The one person in the world who knew about natural selection, Charles Darwin. Imagine you've been thinking about this idea of evolution and natural selection for 20 years. You have yet to publish a single paper on your idea, and now you're holding a manuscript that someone has sent you to put into the literature before you've written your own stuff. It is astounding. Of all the people in the world that could have gotten this manuscript, Charles Darwin panics. He writes, I never saw a more striking coincidence. If Wallace had my manuscript sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better abstract, a short version. So all my originality, whatever it may amount to, will be smashed. Darwin was an honorable person, and he knew he was bound to give this manuscript to people who would arrange for it to be published. 20 years of thinking destroyed like that. I will tell you one other thing. That week, Darwin, this wonderful father, this devoted husband, will have a child die of smallpox at the age of 2. So this week, he will watch one of his own children die. This is a very bad week. What happens is very interesting. It talks about the process of science and what we do to try to be fair. So the power brokers in England, Joseph Hooker on the left, who was the director of the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, and the person on the right, who was a very powerful geologist, Charles Lyell, they arranged for a reading of Wallace's paper, but also, you remember that essay from 1842? They knew of its existence because Darwin had told them, and they arranged for that to be published, a part of it. And they also found a copy of a letter he'd written to someone in the US, the professor of botany at Harvard, Asa Gray. And you can see that letter. And they got a copy of that. And this showed, of course, that Darwin had his idea about natural selection before Wallace. And that gave him, in a sense, priority in time. But as you can see, the last article is the one that Alfred Russel Wallace. So both people get published. They get credit. Does Alfred Russel Wallace know about this? No. He's in the Malay archipelago. It will be months till he finds out that he has been published alongside one of the most famous natural historians, Charles Darwin. So now, what does Darwin do with this? We have these two sets of information. Wallace and Darwin each has discovered the principle of natural selection. Darwin has this big book. I can tell you, it's very hard to read. He knows it's hard to read. He abandons his big book on evolution, and he sits down to write a short abstract of his ideas from the last 22 years of thinking about evolution. Now, when I say short and I say abstract, you may be thinking a page or half a page, maybe 2 or 3 pages. This is his abstract. It's 500 pages long. This is the short version. This is the first edition of On the Origin of Species, published in November of 1859. It is a very thorough but very quickly written and beautifully written book. As I said last night, the most important book written in the history of humankind. It changes everything about who we think we are and where we came from. I want to show you, since I'm here, that the book On the Origin of Species was translated rather quickly in 1877 into Spanish. On the left is the first Spanish translation. The second publication on the right was 1880. And here in the Basque Country in 1994, the translation of On the Origin of Species appeared. And if you're interested in learning about these translations, there is a wonderful website in which the French, the Spanish, the Basque, and the English versions can be seen side by side. And you're thinking, well, how am I going to remember where that is? If you just snap a picture of this QR code, it will take you there. So that's where you go if you want it. Now, what happens? Charles Darwin puts away his very complicated book, and he writes this short version. And because he's writing so quickly, he can't cite everybody. He says, this abstract which I now publish must necessarily be imperfect. I cannot here give references and authorities for my several statements, and I must trust to the reader, reposing some confidence in my accuracy. In other words, the big book had 1,000 citations. This book has almost none. It's very readable. You would like it. I love it. It's something that anyone can read in the public. It's not technical. It's ideas. But now comes an interesting problem. And that problem is the following. He starts to receive a lot of mail. And this is not a good thing. Yes, some of the mail is congratulating him on his bold ideas. Some of the mail is saying that you are absolutely wrong and that you are a terrible person. But then there's a third kind of mail that he gets. And this kind of mail we pick up just a month after he publishes. This is something where we don't have the original piece of mail that came to Darwin, but we have his letter to his friend Joseph Hooker. This is December, 1 month after the book was published. He says, I am surprised that Decaen, a French biologist, should say it was the same as mine. Naudin gives artificial selection as well as a score of English writers, but I cannot find one word like the struggle for existence and natural selection. What has happened is a French biologist has written Darwin and said, hey, wait a second, you Englishmen, I suspect, you wrote this book on evolution and you think natural selection is your idea, but my colleague, my French colleague, Charles Naudin, had these very ideas before you, and you didn't even mention him. Well, this is not so good for Darwin. So he immediately sends for a copy of this paper that was published in 1852. It is on the philosophical considerations on species and varieties. And it is, in fact, a paper about evolution. And you can see here, I've translated just a sentence, with a relatively small number of primordial or primitive kinds, nature successively gave birth to all the plant and animal species that inhabit the globe. Naudin believed in evolution. And he did talk about things that almost seem like natural selection, but he didn't quite get there. But his colleague thought he should have gotten some credit, but he's not in On the Origin of Species. Now, just a few days later, he gets another letter, and this is from a very powerful professor at Oxford University. Now, we don't have the letter from the professor at Oxford, but we have Darwin's letter back to the professor. It tells us everything we know. Darwin says to the professor, Baden-Powell, my health was so poor while I wrote the book that I attempted no history of the subject, nor do I think that I was bound to do so. The only novelty in my work is the attempt to explain how species become modified, and to a certain extent how the theory of descent explains certain large classes of facts. And in these respects, I received no assistance from my predecessors. Is that really possible? We'll come back to that. But in fact, Baden-Powell was not very happy. Baden-Powell had written a book on evolution in 1855. And this essay on the philosophy of creation is all about how the world has evolved from a single set of common ancestors. It was a well-received book. It went into a second edition. And this is a very powerful person. So Darwin is pretty nervous. And he continues to write back to Baden-Powell, "I most fully agree that your work must have had a great effect with philosophical minds in removing prejudices on the subject." Now, he's apologizing because Baden-Powell isn't in On the Origin as someone who came before him. There's no acknowledgement of his predecessors. "I have had to make by letter the same acknowledgement to the author as I believe of the Vestiges." What is Vestiges? Who is the author of Vestiges? Vestiges was a book about evolution that was first published in 1844. It was anonymous. The person was so scared to publish this book that he didn't put his name on it. It was completely anonymous. Darwin suspected correctly who it was, but it went through many, many editions. It was translated into many languages. It was read around the world. It was very inaccurate, but in many ways it still told the world that there was this thing called evolution. And we now know that the author was a Scottish newspaper writer and encyclopedist. His name was Robert Chambers. And you can see in this book, the first step was an advance from the simplest forms of being to the next more complicated, and this through the medium of ordinary process of generation or reproduction. You change a little bit each generation. But the whole book is about evolution. Darwin doesn't talk about this On the Origin of Species. Well, a couple days later, he gets yet another letter. And this is from a philosopher by the name of Herbert Spencer, who is English. And Herbert Spencer's a little bit unhappy with Charles Darwin. "I was so much," Darwin, we don't have Spencer's letter, but we know what it said. "I was so much out of health when I was writing my book," he always said he wasn't feeling so well, "that I grudged every hour of labor and therefore gave no sort of history of progress of opinion." In other words, I didn't put a history of the discipline of evolution into my book. But I've now written a preface in which I give a very brief sketch and have with much pleasure alluded to your excellent essay on evolution. So after getting 5 letters from people who weren't mentioned in his book, which got lots of attention, he decides, I will add an essay about the history of everyone before me who wrote about evolution. And this is, in fact, an 1852 paper that Spencer wrote about evolution, which was a very wonderful article, very short, doesn't have a lot of data, but he's arguing the case that the world has evolved from simpler things. So if you look at the 1860 On the Origin of Species, you will find that there is an introduction and chapter 1. Now, if you look at the next edition, you will find Darwin has solved his problem. There's the introduction, but before that is a historical sketch. And he puts every name he can think of in there so he won't get any more letters. He doesn't want any more letters. So let me tell you about this. Because Darwin was a great evolutionist, he was not such a great historian. He begins, "I will here attempt to give a brief but imperfect sketch of the progress of opinion on the origin of species." This is a very accurate statement. It is definitely imperfect. Let me show you how. Here is the statement. Lamarck, the great French evolutionist of the early 19th century, was the first man whose conclusions on this subject excited much attention. This is not so accurate. Well, here is Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. He first published on evolution in 1801. He is by far the most famous person known who wrote about evolution in the first half of the 19th century. But Darwin would have known about someone else who published about evolution before Lamarck. I take you to a small town, city, kind of, in the British Midlands. This is the town of Lichfield. You see a house in the foreground. You see a church with spires in the background. The person who lived in that house was a person who wrote and thought about evolution. How do we know this? Because he took his family crest, which was 3 shells from the sea, and in it you see something that says, "Econchus omnia," everything from shells. This means they were the lower life forms, the invertebrates of the sea, that came on to land eventually and evolved into us. Now, it's subtle, but I guarantee you, he knew what he meant when he put Econchus omnia. Everything comes from lower forms. Now, The interesting thing is that the person who lived in that church, the reverend, didn't like evolution so much. And so he was very upset with this family crest because the doctor who was in that house, he was a medical doctor, painted that beautiful shell and seal on his carriage. So he went all over the countryside with a sticker that said evolution. The Reverend did not like this. The Reverend then decides to make this go away. So the Reverend writes to the Gentleman's Magazine and threatens the doctor. They only live 100 feet apart, but I guarantee you this plays out in the newspapers. And he writes this little thing and he says, you have to take this off your carriage and stop talking about evolution, or I will make sure you never get another medical job anywhere near here. And it's a wonderful poem that he says, but he basically says, oh, doctor, change your foolish motto, or keep it for some lady's grotto, a little place where she would sit, else thy poor patience may quake, if thou no more canst mend than make. If you don't get this off, I will make sure you never practice medicine again. Now, this is someone you would think Charles Darwin might have heard of, but you might think he was before. I can tell you this is the 1870s. Let me show you what I removed from this, and let me show you who it is. It's Charles Darwin's grandfather, the first evolutionist in England. Did Charles Darwin know his grandfather was an evolutionist? Yes. Did he say Lamarck was the first one to attract much attention? Yes. But in fact, his grandfather actually attracted quite a lot of attention. It's very complicated, but Charles Darwin was born into a family that actually was the leading edge of evolutionary ideas long before Darwin was born. And I can tell you, this is his grandfather, and in 1794, Erasmus Darwin published a book on animals and animal life, and he certainly talked about evolution. Would it be too bold to imagine that in the great lengths of time since the earth began to exist, perhaps millions of ages before the commencement of the history of mankind, that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament, like our ancestor right here? Darwin writes later in his life, in his autobiography, I'd previously read the Zoonomy of my grandfather in which similar views are maintained, but perhaps it didn't have any effect on me. I don't know that I buy that. But it's very complicated when these things are in your family. Okay, so for natural selection, let's ask the question. We know there were many people who wrote about evolution before Charles Darwin. Were Darwin and the first to come up with the idea of natural selection? Well, no. So what happens to Darwin again in the newspapers? In 1860, someone writes a letter to a big newspaper about gardening and agriculture. His name is Patrick Matthew. He's Scottish. And he says, I noticed that there's a long quotation from the London Times stating that Mr. Darwin professes to have discovered the existence of the natural law of selection. This discovery turns out to be what I published very fully as far back as 1831. Well, Darwin picks up a copy, not so happy, okay, another problem. So Darwin writes back, he's a very honorable person. He says into the newspaper, I freely acknowledge that Mr. Matthew has anticipated by many years the explanation which I have offered of the origin of species under the name of natural selection. I can do no more than offer my apologies to Mr. Matthew for my entire ignorance of his publication. And we have never heard of Matthew since, have we? You don't learn about Matthew. Well, where did Matthew publish it? Was it in a book that anyone could have read, like Charles Darwin's grandfather? No, it was a book about growing trees to cut them up into Navy ships. It's called Naval Timber and Arboriculture. And this book is all about how to make ships out of trees. What did Patrick Matthew do? He grew trees. But in the very end, in an appendix, he has a little statement, which is in fact a statement over a couple of paragraphs about the principle of natural selection. Easily missed, one might, unless you were reading about how to build ships. But in fact, Patrick Matthew had this idea. Now, was he the only other one? No, we now know in 1818 there was an essay, and it was an essay, a very strange essay, but anyway, it had an interesting idea about human evolution. And it said that if humans were exposed to diseases, if certain people had the ability to withstand diseases, they would survive, and if you didn't have the ability to withstand diseases, you would die. And that with time, those that withstood diseases would be the ones that would continue, and you might have this disease resistance. Well, this is actually a true statement, that evolution, in fact, can be a very harsh judge of humans if you don't have disease resistance. But it's only for change within humans, not from one species to another, a single cell to me. But it is, in fact, natural selection. And I would just tell you, Darwin, someone wrote to him about it, and he knew, he said, aha, we add this to the essay in the front of my book, but it's within humans. And finally, I will tell you there's someone in 1794 from Scotland who writes a book, and he writes out the idea of natural selection. Those which depart most from the best adapted constitution will be most liable to perish if you are less fit, while those which most approach to the best constitution for the present circumstances will be best adapted to continue in preserving themselves and multiplying the race. That is natural selection. And he says it is true not just of humans, but of every plant species growing in the wild in a forest or meadow. But I can tell you that this person, James Hutton, never thought of this process as changing one species into another. He thought about it for species over geological time. As the environments changed, you moved a little bit this way or a little bit that way. But it was not about evolution. It was all within species. So here's the question we have to ask. I made a sort of a bad portrait of Darwin, you might think. Maybe he's given more credit than he deserves. So let's ask, is Darwin given more credit than he deserves? And this really comes to something we have to ask. What is the nature of scientific discovery? Well, to discover something, you have to interpret and come up with what I would say is an idea that explains something. I mean, just describing stuff is just cataloging. Describing stuff and understanding things, that's discovery. It's insight. It's an idea. So in the case of the idea of evolution, that all of life on Earth has evolved from a single cell 4 billion years ago. It turns out that before Charles Darwin, many people published about this idea. And in fact, in his historical sketch, he adds about 37 names, and these names are all included in his historical sketch. Many of them are not scientists. They just believe that evolution happens. They don't make a good case. Some of them are scientists, and they make a small sort of case for things. But let me show you, Darwin's list, they're all over the world. I am very interested in this. I can tell you there are at least another 20 or 25 or 30 beyond Darwin. Some of them are incredibly obscure, and there isn't even any scholarship. But for about 100 years before On the Origin of Species, people all over Europe were publishing about evolution in all kinds of languages. So was Darwin the first evolutionist? No. But why do we remember him and not Bory de Saint Vincent or de Maillet or Fries or Geoffroy or Grant or Haldeman, all names that mean nothing. So let's look at not just the idea of evolution, but the idea of a mechanism for evolution, natural selection. Now that we can say there were 5 people came up with, including Charles Darwin. Darwin, as we know, Wallace, separately in the Malay Archipelago, Patrick Matthew in the middle in 1831 and 32 in an appendix to a book on trees, someone who writes about disease resistance in 1818, and on the left with his ear trumpet, James Hutton in 1794. Now you can have an idea, and that's a wonderful thing. Ideas are not cheap. They're actually one of the hardest earned currencies in science. Again, describing things is just cataloging. Understanding is the bit of science that's magic. Having an idea. I can't tell you where ideas come from, but for any of us who are scientists, we know it's the most exhilarating part of our lives, to have an idea, to understand and have insight. But then you have to do something else. You have to understand the importance of that idea. If you think your idea is the one that changes the way everyone in the world should think, you should understand that. And I will tell you that James Hutton never thought of natural selection as anything other than the regulation of a single or many different species over time, accommodating climate change, from glaciers to warming times to drier to wetter. So he didn't see beyond this mechanism of things basically like domestication, history of animals and plants for humans. He didn't see it. So we can remove him. That's it. Wells, in 1818, he saw this as an evolution of disease resistance. It's a great idea, but he never conceived of anything else. Well, Patrick Matthew did see this as something really for all of life, but let's ask a simple question. If Patrick Matthew thought he had the key to the universe, why did he put it at the end of a book on building ships? He clearly did not realize what this meant in geology, geography, in every branch of the natural sciences. He could not have understood it, or he certainly wouldn't have put it in such an obscure place. Only two people understood what natural selection meant in terms of bringing the human race into the modern world, and that was Charles Darwin and it was Alfred Russel Wallace. Now, we should celebrate both of them rightly. Wallace is every bit Darwin's equal. We don't hear of him as much, and now I'm going to tell you why. Because both Wallace and Darwin understood that this was the key insight to the whole world of life. But then you've got to do one more thing in science. If you have an idea and you understand that idea is profound, you have to go convince the world. You just don't toss it out there. You have to convince others that this idea is correct. And in this way, Wallace is removed. Because what did Darwin do after Wallace wrote him a letter and said, publish this manuscript, please? He wrote the book. He wrote On the Origin of Species. He published it. It is beautifully written. It covers every idea about evolution, the fossil record, the geological record, biogeography, hybridism, domestication history. It is a masterpiece. It takes one brilliant idea and it extends it. Variation under domestication, variation under nature, the struggle for existence, natural selection, the laws of variation, difficulties. Well, maybe I don't have all the answers. Let me be honest, I don't. Instinct, the evolution of mind is in this book. Hybridism, the imperfections of the geological record, the fossil record. He has whole 2 chapters on this. And then why are certain organisms found in Australia that aren't found in Europe or not found in Asia? There's an evolutionary explanation. He goes on. He talks about development, embryology, and then he concludes this summation of 500 pages with the most profound synthesis of 22 years of thought written in one short year. And I'll give you the last words here to Alfred Russel Wallace. Wallace understood what Darwin had done. And if anyone should have insight, Wallace should. He understood natural selection. Mr. Darwin has created a new science and a new philosophy. And I believe that never has such a complete illustration of a new branch of human knowledge been due to the labors and researches of a single man. He wrote the book. He didn't just have an idea. He didn't just have an idea he understood. He sold it to the world. Never have such vast masses of widely scattered and hitherto utterly disconnected facts been combined into a system and brought to bear upon the establishment of such a grand and new and simple philosophy. Wallace knew Darwin had changed the world, even though Wallace had had independently the same insights. And as he wrote himself to Charles Darwin, he said, "As to the theory of natural selection itself, I shall always maintain it to be actually yours and yours only." Wallace was a very, very gentle, gracious, and generous person. No ego. My paper, the one he sent to Darwin, would never have convinced anybody or been noticed as more than an ingenious speculation, as many before had been, whereas your book has revolutionized the study of natural history. So discovery is complicated in science. It's also incredibly beautiful to understand. Sometimes we simplify stories and you have one name, and it's Darwin. Darwin isn't the only person who discovered evolution, but he is the person who helped the world understand evolution with his novel insights and his synthesis of information. So what I would tell you is, Charles Darwin did discover evolution in a certain way, even though he was the 70th person on the planet to write about it. Thank you.